Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Ashante Aller, and I am a core faculty member here at UAGC, and I will be the host of our session today, Creativity at the Core. By joining us today, you acknowledge that this session is being recorded and will be shared with TLC-related materials. Microphones will be muted for this presentation, but we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat. Also, we have enabled live transcription. If you would like to use it, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Now, I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Ellen Beatty, Associate Faculty Member here at UAGC. Dr. Ellen Beatty is an educational leader, developer, and consultant specializing in positive academic leadership, online teaching and learning, and neuroscience. Currently, she is the Chief of Adult Instructional Services for the Maryland Department of Labor, with oversight of the adult education system serving 33,000 learners annually. Dr. Beatty's teaching spans undergraduate through doctoral learners in the content areas of student success, educational leadership, and educational technology. She operates an educational consulting platform, the Center for Intentional Learning, where she supports the academic community in neuroscience-based teaching and learning, online faculty and student success, student retention, and educational leadership. Thank you, Dr. Beatty. I will let you take it from here.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you so much for all of you who are here listening to my speech about creativity. So today we're talking about creativity, and we are framing it from a perspective of a 21st century essential workplace skill. So Linda, if you don't mind, let's launch our first poll, because I would really love for our audience to answer one simple question for me. Do you consider yourself a creative person? Yes or no? All right, I'm sharing our results. It looks like 75% of us here today actually do consider ourselves to be a creative person. That's wonderful. That is higher than most of the averages that I saw when I was looking at some of the research. So you may be asking, why are we even talking about creativity? Well, two recent events prompted my interest in creativity. One was that I took the VIA assessment for a second time a couple of years ago. And out of 24 individual strengths, the one that popped up #1 for me was creativity. And that was really a moment of self-reflection for me, because I would not have really answered the question, do I consider myself to be a creative person, as a yes. But somehow it popped up to be the top strength that I had. So that allowed a lot of self-reflection. How does creativity show up in my life? How does creativity show up in my positions, in my teaching, in my educational leadership? But a second recent event also prompted this inquiry into creativity, and that was the LinkedIn employer survey in 2019 and 2020 listed creativity as the #1 most in-demand employer needed skill, soft skill. Now that's fascinating to me, because they also mentioned this gap between the need for creativity and the actual level of creativity that they were seeing in newly hired employees. So a creative employee can appreciate problems, approach problems and tasks in new and different ways. They found that creativity is needed across all levels of the organization, all levels of employees, all roles in the organization, and especially on the leadership level. Creative leaders create environments where creativity can be flourishing. So those two elements really caused me to think about creativity. And so I come to you today, not as an expert in creativity, but really more as just a curious researcher into what creativity looks like these days. So we are going to talk about creativity as a 21st century skill. Why and what is going on in the workforce that's making creativity rise to the top? We're going to understand creativity by first defining and measuring in the most traditional senses. And then we're going to look at neuroscience, because what we have found out, the ability to look into the brain at moments that creativity is happening, really helps us to understand what's going on in there. We are also going to talk about what gets in our way when we are trying to be creative. I'm going to leave you with two important parts: the creativity research insights, if you are looking to promote a creative workplace for yourself and your colleagues, and also, as promised, some classroom implementation, because that is what brings us all together here today. So let's ask the question, why does creativity matter? Why the new or renewed interest in creativity? Well, workforces always experience skill shifts, skills that are needed to advance the workforce. Often those skill shifts happen because of reactions to workforce changes or challenges like globalization. And often it is technology that's driving those skill requirements. So it will be no surprise to anyone that we live in an information-rich environment. And interestingly, when that happens, knowledge itself actually diminishes in value. It's really what we can do with that knowledge, how we can connect ideas, how we can connect disciplines to find new and innovative ways to move forward. The skill shift is also in response to an uncertain future, the future of automation, the future of globalization. All of those situations require that we have employees and students who can adapt, who can change, who can push us to innovation. Finally, the future of work lies in soft and human skills, because those are the skills that are needed to support the hard skills. The hard skills in and of themselves are not enough to take us where we need to go. We also need skills like creativity, emotional intelligence, communication, those skills to support our hard skills. Creativity also matters because it's an alternative to our normal way to solve problems. Most of us take a very analytical approach to solving whatever problems are in front of us. And it's not that that's bad, but creativity offers a more intuitive way of solving problems, promotes our humanality to problem solving. So creative employees are independent thinkers. They are able to solve complex problems, to synthesize the massive amounts of data we have into actionable strategies to move forward. They're also able to draw connections and conclusions that we need to be able to progress. So those are some of the reasons why creativity matters, and it matters as a 21st century workforce skill. Okay, so I thought it would be fun to get us started with a little bit of a creativity exercise for ourselves. So I'm going to give you a second to grab a piece of paper and a pencil, or your phone and your notes application. This is called the Wild Wild West. I want you to, in 2 minutes, I'll start the timer in a second, to write down as many cereal box toys that you can think of if cereal boxes were around during the nostalgic era of the American Wild Wild West. So that is your prompt. Here are your 2 minutes. As many cereal box toys that you can think of that would have come out of a cereal box if those things existed during the American Wild Wild West. And let's start. 1 minute. All right, so that was our 2 minutes. So take a moment and count up how many cereal box toys you came up with. If you are comfortable, please share the number in the chat box. There's no judgment here. There's also no prizes, unfortunately, because we're not in person. But if you wouldn't mind sharing how many unique cereal box toys you got, that would be awesome. Oh, Kelly, 13, Connie, 16, Ryan, 27. Yes, 9, 12. Awesome. So this was just a very short creativity exercise that you could use and adapt in any situation. What I'm going to do as I go through the rest of my presentation, though, is kind of draw on some of the experiences that you may or may not have had as you were going through this exercise. So let's look at understanding creativity. So I love the Albert Einstein quote at the top, creativity is intelligence, having fun. So as we start to understand creativity, we have to do it from the foundation. So how are we defining creativity? Well, there is no shortage of definitions for creativity, but 2 elements that you will commonly see in any definition. First is something novel. It's something unique. It's something that has not been seen before. It's original. That is always paired with the usefulness of something being considered creative, which means you can have something novel, never seen before, unique, but if it's not useful, then most definitions of creativity are not going to consider that something of creative value. Now, of course, context plays a part in this too. Something that could be novel, never been seen before, original in one context, could be the same old in another context. So context plays a role in all of this. 2 ways to measure creativity really stemmed from this work in the 1950s when there were calls from the scientific community and the research community to start exploring this concept of creativity. One is the remote associates test. Now you've probably seen this one before. You have 3 words. I just chose loser, throat, and spot, and you have to come up with the word that kind of connects all of those together, the word that can be paired with each of those and make sense. If you know the answer, I'm sure some of you do out there, you can definitely throw it into the chat box. That's the remote associates test. The other one that you might have heard of, which has a very long history, is the alternative uses tests, where you are given a common object and asked to come up with uncommon uses for that object. For example, here is a pair of scissors. We all know what they are typically used for, but what other uses could you use these scissors for? Just gets us out of our primary patterns of thought and asks us to explore. So yeah, I see a chat. Wally Beatty, who ironically has the same last name as me and also teaches here at UAGC, came up with sore. Yes, sore loser, sore throat, sore spot. Excellent. Awesome. Thanks. Okay, so those were the two that stood the test of time for a long time. It's only been recently that we have been able to peer into the brain at the very exact moment when these moments of insight or creativity were happening. And that brings us to the neuroscience of creativity. And there are two perspectives that I want to bring out for you in our short time together. The first one is that we now understand creativity, like we understand a lot of cognitive processes, to be a whole brain activity. So we have took a close look at what are the neural circuits that are involved while we are being creative. And so the one that you have probably commonly heard about is the default mode network. This is the brain network that is in action when we are doing things like daydreaming or letting our mind wander. It is also when we are brainstorming. So that is one of the ones that the press has kind of held on to, right? So you've probably heard that the default mode network is critical to our ability to be creative, and that's true. But just like creativity isn't just one thing, it's a process. There's an evolution of coming up with creative insights and creative thoughts. The executive network, the prefrontal cortex, what allows us to make decisions, and the salience network. The salience network allows us to internally monitor our internal and external thoughts and stimulations. So all three of those networks come together to help us understand that we are using our whole brain when we are being creative. That research came out of Penn State. Another Beatty, no connection to that. The second one, how many of you, I know that this is true, how many of you have ever sat on a difficult problem and you racked your brain and you put forth all of your cognitive energy behind it and you really just couldn't come up with what the right solution was for you? So you go home and you sleep on it, and the next day you wake up and you're in the shower and all of a sudden, bam, the solution appears, right? That aha moment that we wish sometimes came a little more often than it does. That is a perfect example of what we can now see in real time, how we can identify the neural patterns that are happening in our brain at that moment. So at that time of insight, we can now see gamma waves in the right hemisphere at that exact moment. And if you're using those remote association tests, it's when you come up with that word, right? But even more importantly, seconds before that, alpha waves appeared in the posterior right hemisphere of the brain. Now, you can think about the alpha waves as being those really slow waves that happen. You can almost think about it as downshifting. And to the researchers, that was the really important part, because obviously it's important to know where those moments of insight are happening, but what is immediately preceding it? So what this tells us is that in the moments that precede those moments of insight, they actually have specific neural signatures, which is really, really interesting. So we can't have a conversation about creativity without talking a little bit about the obstacles that get in our way. The first one I want to talk about is misconceptions. That idea that I am just not a creative person, right? We have in our minds what creativity is and what it is not, and we've gone with that for a very long time. But the misconceptions about creativity is what hinders our ability to be creative people. Another thing that I think kind of plays into this is the whole idea of when they started initially measuring creativity, they come out with this concept of the big C creative person and the little c creative person. The big C creative people are the Picassos and the Steve Jobs, those type of big thinkers, those paradigm shift people in the world. Yes, and that is certainly a part of that creative genius. But the little c is the creativity that you see in each and every one of us on a daily basis. So I think some of that played into our belief that only the great big C creativity mattered, and that's really not true. Another thing that gets in our way of being creative is our knowledge base. So just like when you have a broad base of knowledge, critical thinking is easier because you have different ideas to pull from to solve that problem. It's the same thing with creativity. So you can think about this as a connection back to our Wild Wild West example. So say you didn't know anything about the American Wild Wild West. Maybe you didn't grow up here. Maybe you weren't around. Maybe they didn't teach that in school. That would give you a much more difficult time to be creative with that specific exercise because your base of knowledge just isn't sufficient to do that. We can also think about this with our students, right? Because depending on the level of our student, we might be asking more or less of them than they're really capable of doing based on their level and knowledge base. But probably the most important one and the biggest one, and the reason why the image is the biggest right there, is our inner critic. You know, that critic, that negative self-talk. You're not very creative anyway. You probably, nobody likes that idea. You know, that negative self-talk that happens unconsciously for us. It shoots down our creative ideas even before they have a chance to flourish. And if I connect that back to the Wild Wild West experience, how many of you in that 2 minutes, which when you're trying to work, 2 minutes can seem like a really long time. How many of you had a couple of moments where you weren't writing anything down, right? You just couldn't think of anything. In those moments, any chance that that inner critic came out? Well, you probably weren't very creative anyway. I knew you couldn't do this. I knew you'd only get 3. Everyone else is going to have more than you. That inner critic is really what stifles our creativity, probably more than anything else. So part of helping us to be more creative is silencing that inner critic and silencing it for our colleagues and also our students. Okay, so some research insights as we are starting to get to the end of our time together. How can we create a space where creativity can thrive? And I think about this from my leadership perspective. How can I create an environment where my team, where their creativity can thrive? The first is psychological safety. No one is going to come up with creative ideas or share those creative ideas if they don't feel safe, if they feel that their ideas are going to be discounted too quickly. So we need to consider psychological safety of our environments. We also need to know that ideas take time and space to grow. Over time, if you graph idea generation charts, at the beginning, you'll come up with a lot of good ideas. They're not necessarily the most creative ideas, but if we look back at that Wild Wild West experience, you probably came up with a lot right off the bat, right? But over time, they kind of trickled in, right? Ooh, this one. And then maybe that idea prompted another idea. But the speed at which they were coming slowed. But research has shown that those that trickle in as time passes are actually the more creative ideas. So we need to make sure that we're giving our colleagues and ourselves and our students time to grow our ideas. Another example of a space where we can create creativity is coming from the flow research, the research on and getting into flow and how flow can really put us in a productive state. And one of the most important parts about flow is that we have a balance between the perceived challenge that we are trying to overcome and our own skill set. So we need to make sure if we are helping other people to be creative, that we're matching those. We're not giving people something far too challenging for themselves or something that they are not going to consider themselves that already have a foundational level of skills to do that. And finally, collaboration. Collaboration is a wonderful way that we can thread together your knowledge base and my knowledge base to be able to come up with some amazing creative ideas. So here we go, creativity in the classroom. How can we do that? How can we encourage our students? Well, the first one is probably the most important one, probably should be at the end, but we can frame creativity as a skill, not as this mystical talent that you either have or you don't have, but a skill that you can practice, a skill that you can build upon. The second one is we can encourage inward reflection. A lot of research about when we go inside, when we internally, when we take out all of the external sensory things that are constantly coming at us, it's in those moments that we actually have our most creative thoughts. You can do inward reflections in your classroom through things like journaling, if you're comfortable with sharing a meditation practice, all ways to kind of come inside yourself. Brainstorming sessions can be fantastic in a group setting. And also you can encourage choice. Anywhere you can within your curriculum, if you can encourage choice, when students are invested in the choice, when they have choice, they are more invested in the outcomes of those situations. And you can use simple creativity exercises, just like we use the Wild Wild West, or you can use other examples, right? So here is a binder clip, right? We all know what binder clips are for, even though as we go to a more paperless world, they become less and less important. But you could use this for an alternative uses example. So what other uses could you come up with for this binder clip? So they don't always necessarily need to be 100% aligned with the content of your course, right? But they do need to be expressly shared to encourage our students to see themselves as creative. So I am going to, of course, end any academic presentation with a couple of sources, but I'm also going to do one more thing. If you are interested in this topic, if the future of work and if creativity interests you, I want to share two book recommendations. They are both fantastic. Human Work talks about what the workforce is going to look like as we automate things. You'll see a lot about creativity and the human aspects in that book. And also the Eureka Factor is a fantastic marriage of the brain science behind creativity and aha moments and very practical solutions and implementation ideas. So I'm going to leave you with those. I want to thank you so much for your time. It is always such a pleasure to see my UAGC colleagues at the Teaching and Learning Conference. I appreciate being here every year with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Beatty. And, we have a tight time schedule. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to questions. So if people have questions, what would be the best way for them to get those to you?
You know what? I will put my email address in the chat box. And if anyone would like to put their email into the chat box, I can make sure that you get a copy of the presentation. And then if you have any other questions, we can certainly address them.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Beatty. And thank you to everyone in the audience for your participation in today's session. We encourage you to attend the next keynote presentation with Dr. Karen Sibley, which is titled Serving Students, Transforming Society, which takes place today at 2 o'clock. So enjoy the rest of TLC and thank you everyone for your time. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.